This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for the 8th report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation series. Our report today, Regulatory Incentives and Disincentives for Utility Investments in Grid Modernization. The U.S. Department of Energy envisions a modern electric power grid that is more resilient, reliable, secure, affordable, flexible, and sustainable. But grid modernization requires investment in distribution and transmission infrastructure. Our new report covers 3 perspectives on whether utilities have the appropriate incentives to invest in grid modernization. First, Steve Keim, a chartered financial analyst, explains what's top of mind for utility managers, investments that create the most value for existing shareholders. Steve explains the simple math that supports that principle, and he describes utility shareholder incentives that regulators could consider to encourage grid modernization investments when they're in the public interest, but perhaps not the best choice for increasing existing shareholder value. Next, Dr. Janice Beecher applies an institutional framework to the topic. She finds that the traditional model of rates-based rates of return regulation provides powerful incentives for utilities to pursue grid modernization, but it requires effective implementation to serve the public interest. Any special incentives should be used only if they are consistent with the core goal of economic regulation. Rounding out the panel is Ron Lair, a clean energy consultant and a former utility regulator. From his perspective, incentives embedded in the traditional regulatory model ignore solutions that third parties and consumers can offer. Instead, he believes that utility incentives should be better aligned with grid modernization and public policies. And he calls for alternative regulatory approaches to replace some of our litigated regulatory processes in order to better keep pace with changes in the electricity industry. Today, these authors will present their perspective, and then we'll take questions from the audience. First, I'll take a few minutes to tell you about the report series and go over the logistics. This series of reports is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policymakers, and the electricity industry. The series uses a multiple perspectives format to present different views on the future of utility regulation and business models and the trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds this series. 8 reports are completed so far, including this one. And our next report, number 9, will address new value-added services that grid modernization enables and the roles of utilities and third-party providers in a modern grid. An advisory group helps prioritize what topics we cover, provides guidance on how we cover them, and reviews the draft reports, and we are grateful for their help. So before I turn over the mic for today's presentations, here are a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website. And second, because of the large number of participants today, everyone is in listen mode only, so please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments at any time. We'll answer as many as we can following the presentation. You may want to direct your question to a specific author and note that in your question or comment. The report authors will have about 45 minutes to present all together. I'll then moderate questions and answers with the authors. The report and webinar slides are posted at the website shown, and following the webinar, we'll post a recording. So today, our presenters are Steve Keim. He's a principal and chief economist at Seventh Wave. He's worked in the field of utility regulation for 36 years, including 21 years at the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and master's degrees in financial economics and quantitative methods from the University of Wisconsin. He's a chartered financial analyst. Dr. Janice Beecher has served as director of the Institute of Public Utilities at Michigan State University since 2002 with more than 30 years of applied research experience. She's a frequent author and lecturer, and earlier in her career she worked at the Illinois Commerce Commission. Jan has a PhD in political science from Northwestern and teaches graduate classes in public policy and regulation at Michigan State. And finally, Ron Lair practices law and consults on energy regulation and business matters, including planning, utility business models, and regulatory reforms. He was chairman and commissioner of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, and he has served on numerous corporate and foundation boards. So following the presentations, we'll respond to questions you post in the chat box. Please enter your questions at any time. Let's begin our presentations. Steve?
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to dive right in here since we don't have a lot of time. And one of the main points of my talk is to make sure we're asking the right question. And what I see in reviewing testimony or looking at the trade press is we're actually generally asking the wrong question. The notion that returns on equity help utilities attract capital from new investment, that's actually the wrong question. We can answer that question unequivocally. All utilities today, whether they make 8% on equity or 18% on equity, can raise capital for grid modernization, and they can do it at about the same cost. I'll show you that with the real data from the financial markets. The relevant question, and this is an important one, is would that investment create value for their current shareholders? We're going to see that the value proposition is not about new investors. It's about creating value propositions for the existing investors, which get impounded into the stock price. So it's a stock price analysis, and we don't see a lot of that in regulation. The framing of this, though, is conventional corporate finance. Some of the things that people are going to hear today might sound strange based on regulation, but regulation is a book value construct. We're talking about creating market value for utility investors, but I've put some text up here. Best Practices for Equity Analysts. That was written by Jim Valentine, who worked for 15 years at Morgan Stanley. He was one of the top analysts on Wall Street. McKinsey's Valuation book. Asaf Damodaran, who teaches at NYU, is the world's leading expert on valuation. Credit Suisse, Investment Bank, and Morningstar. You've probably heard of all of those entities. They use the same framework as I'm using, but it's going to look perhaps different than a lot of us think about in regulation. Notice the two blue arrows at the bottom. This is Credit Suisse and Damodaran coming together to present a cost of equity analysis. And that is the broken blue line. And you can see that for the past 15 years, the cost of equity for this estimate for the S&P 500 has been in the low 8s. That means the cost of equity for utility for the last 15 years has been in the low 7s. And if we look at Morningstar, here's an analysis for Excel, and let's be very careful about what I'm saying here. Because some people may be reacting, thinking I'm trying to lower the return on equity down to the 7s. That's exactly the opposite of what I'm trying to do. But here is what Morningstar says about Excel. These are the long-run equilibrium numbers. In the long run, Excel's return on equity beyond 2019 will be 10%. The long-run expected return on the stock is 7.5%, the cost of equity. Now, many people in regulation try to bring those two together, but if you do, you actually destroy any incentive opportunity for utilities. So this is actually an equilibrium stable position that creates an incentive for Excel to invest. So there's nothing wrong with that in an editorial sense. That seems to be a reasonable situation. But I want to step back for a second and talk about who makes the investment decision, the capital allocation decision. Because people who suggest that returns on equity, high returns on equity, are necessary to attract capital are assuming that the capital market makes the decision to allocate capital. It only prices securities. Market's function is to price securities. As Credit Suisse, Michael Mauboussin at Credit Suisse says, capital allocation is the senior manager's #1 job. If you think that the capital markets are in charge of that, you would have essentially ceded your most important job to a financial market. That's not true. The decision is made by the management, and the goal is to build per share stock price. We're going to talk a lot about value. It's not expressed in percentages. It's always expressed in dollars, such as a stock price. And here's some good analysis by EEI that this is more than semantics. I want you to look at the wording here. This is about FERC's transmission ROEs, which were designed to create incentives for utilities to build transmission. coming down from 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, etc. EEI says, okay, these projects have a lot of upfront development time, long construction schedules, and overall risk. I'm with them on that. And here's the important point. They hit this right on the head. If they don't get a sufficient ROE, it doesn't say we won't be able to attract capital, because they could attract capital. What will happen is they will choose different projects, because different projects will create more value for their existing investors. So it's a value proposition, and it's a decision of the management, and the capital markets are merely facilitators here. They don't prevent investment at all. They actually make it easier for utilities to invest. So how do we create value? Well, think back to that Excel. The ROE was 10 and the cost of equity is 7.5. That's what we need, McKinsey and Company. We need a gap between those two. If there's no gap between the return and the cost of equity, then no matter how much money the utility invests, it can't create shareholder value for its existing investors. And we add one more term here. We see the full well, this is really the short form. I'll show you the full model in a second. But this is the conceptual model that utilities, regulators, advocates can use to get an idea of whether an investment creates value. So we have that gap between the return and the cost of equity, R minus K, which are percentages, but we've got to convert it into dollars. I is the amount of investment that goes into the project, billions of dollars, and then what comes out is the value proposition, and this is a little slippery, that pushes the portion that will push the stock price up, the contribution to value for the existing investors from a future investment. So there's a time dimension here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, so if a regulator was looking at this formula and had some policy levers, they would think, well, how does my policy affect the expected return on equity? How might it affect the systematic risk? We have to be careful here. The systematic risk, utilities cost of equity is a function only of about three things: interest rates, recession, inflation. For example, the Southern Company's Plant Vogtle issues do not enter the cost of equity. They would enter the ability of the utility to earn a return. So we have to be really careful to use this model correctly. And then finally, the I is about differences in investment scale. We're going to do an example where we see that investment scale can actually dominate this equation and drive the most value. We will get to that in a moment as well. I wanted to actually show you a full stock pricing model because that R minus K times I is merely a component of a real stock pricing model. This is a model that my colleagues at LB&L and I would use. The Department of Energy has asked us to build stock pricing models so that it can test things like what happens to utility stocks, to actual utility stocks. These are the real ones. What happens to the individual stock prices when interest rates go up, or if investment growth slows. We've done studies. You can actually find those on the LB&L website about using a model like this. But if you notice over on the right, that R minus K times I is the incremental component. It's the first year contribution to share price from an incremental investment. And notice if R is equal to K, if you set return equal to the cost of equity, that's going to be 0 no matter how big I is. So back to Excel, 10 and 7.5, investment will create value for Excel and for the typical utility today. Now I'm going to use I like to use real data because this framework actually is the framework that is used by investors on Wall Street. It actually conforms to the data, it matches the data. I'm going to use two utilities, Alliant Energy, which is from my home state of Wisconsin, and P&M Resources, which is located in New Mexico. I'm not going to offer any comment on how these numbers were derived or whether they're good or bad. I just want to show you that the market is going to reflect these numbers in the pricing of the securities. So the Value Line Investment Survey, widely used document. If you see down at the bottom, the last line is return on common equity. So 2016 and 2017 at the holding company, Value Line expects 11% returns on equity, and they expect an uptick to 12.5% in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, I don't know why Value Line projects that, and that's not really my concern. I'm going to take that number as is. So Alliant makes 12.5. P&M Resources, also from Value Line, you see their returns on equity are lower. 7.5 and 8 currently, going up to 9.5. So perhaps Value Line thinks all utility returns on equity are going up. I'm going to take these numbers. But the question now, to see if you have this financial concept down, which utility can attract capital more easily? Well, I already told you up front, it doesn't matter what the ROE is, and so that should actually be borne out in the data, and it is. So if we take all 40 utilities that Value Line follows, all 40 electric utilities, and on the x-axis we plot that long-run return on equity, and we see P&M at about 9.5, and if you go down to the x-axis for Alliant, about 12.5. And on the y-axis, we put the price. How much do I have to pay? And this is the key. How much do I have to pay to get a share of each of these stocks? If you could get Alliant at book value, that would be an awesome investment because you would make 12.5%. But you have to pay 2.2 times book value to get Alliant. It turns out when you work that through, you've diluted your return down to about 7.5, which is the number, that same number for Excel. Similarly, you have to pay a little bit more than book value for P&M, but not as much. You pay about 1.4 times book value. And when you work this through, guess what you get for an expected return for P&M? The same, now showing the next page, the same number. Alliant is no more attractive to new investors than P&M Resources. Essentially all utilities, notice that whether you make 8 or 18%, you will, as a new investor, new capital provider, earn about the same return. That's got to be the case in terms of a market that's pricing securities rationally. Why does the 18% get it converted down to that 7.5 or 8? Because if you look way out on the right-hand side, you have to pay 3 times book value for it. Why does an 8% return stock produce about the same return? Because you pay about a little bit more than book value for it. So here's the function of the capital markets, is simply pricing these securities. So the idea that a higher ROE, if we raise P&M Resources ROE in advance of a project, its stock price would immediately go up before it issued the capital. And we're going to see that's an ex-ante gain for the existing investors. That's where the value proposition lies. Now, that does not mean that the return on equity isn't important, because the return on equity is critically important, and if you look at the top of the slide, creates value for the present investors. So when Alliant announces a project that investors didn't know about, because if they know about it, it's already in the stock price, but a new investment, and they can earn that holding company return, I'm just going to assume that for the moment, they can create much more value, much more contribution to the per share stock price, because it's that gap times the investment. Then P&M can also create value, but not as much. So there's a greater value proposition for the present investors at Alliant because of its higher return. This is where that return on equity comes in terms of supporting and pushing up the existing stock price. We don't want to, the idea that we want to create attractive propositions for new investors is like saying, I want to sell my house to the lowest bidder. We want new investors to pay as much as possible to buy in, and the more they pay, the more we benefit our existing investors. It's a value proposition for these two investor groups, new and existing, are at arm's length. And we want, the managers work for the existing investors, not the new investors. And this is because the new investors price the securities at either 2 times book value or 1.4 times book value or 3 times book value. That all equalizes out. That's what they get. Again, there's no advantage to investing in Alliant or P&M if you're a new investor. There's a huge advantage if you're an existing investor. You're going to get more value gains. So let's take an actual example. Let's say a utility wants to build a substation for $500 million. It makes 10% on equity, and in this case, their cost of equity is 10. The regulator said, we would like you to build a two-way flow, a more modern grid. Same return, same cost of equity, $400 million of capital. Now, a lot of people would say the utility will be indifferent because they focus on the wrong thing. They focus on that 10%. The correct answer is shown through the value frame. $15 million. The utility has a strong incentive to invest in the substation, in this case, simply because it's bigger. Scale can loom large in utility capital budgeting. Now, can we fix it? Well, yes, let's put the ROE on the two-way flow. Here's a real incentive to do grid modernization. I'm going to give you 12 utility if you do the two-way flow. Now we've converted that value proposition to the smaller asset because it has a high enough return. Just working through that simple R minus K times I. But not any higher return will do. This is the most interesting case. What if we set the return at 10.5 instead of 10? Well, now the lower return on the bigger asset creates more value than the higher return on the smaller asset. That happens all the time in utility analysis. That scale variable, Looms laws, the ROEs, they all interact. And I want to actually paint this. Here's the whole thing in one complicated slide. But if you look at, let's look at the two investor groups, the new investors and the existing investors. Who provides the $500 million? The new investors provide all of it. What do new investors expect to make on the investment? They expect to make the cost of equity, which is priced into the stock, 7. Who gets the $15 million? The $15 million inures to the benefit of the existing investors through a higher stock price. That very stock price that the new investors have to pay is actually benefits, and I notice that I call it a windfall because the existing investors don't put any money in. They just sit there and watch this on the sideline and get wealthier. And this is something that financial economists have been telling regulators for 50 years. It's not the new investor. It's the existing investor, and you're trying to create, look at this as a quote from Stuart Myers. The title of the article could hardly be more apt. The application of finance theory to public utility rate cases. An opportunity to earn on an investment that earns more than the cost of capital creates an immediate gain. This is a windfall because it's realized ex ante. Before the utility issues new shares of stock, when the utility issues new shares of stock to the project, this value proposition will already be in there, and the new investors will make the same as they would have if the utility hadn't done the project, but the existing investors will be wealthier. So this is the thing. You can use this simple frame to actually analyze incentives and policies, and if you're looking for a specific answer from me as to here's 6 possible incentive mechanisms. You notice the answer is the same in all cases. It's a big thud. It depends. It depends on RK and I for all of the assets. So individual utilities, individual regulators, individual technologies, each will produce a value contribution. You have to calculate all of these for all resources on the table to figure out which one drives the stock price up more. So there's no general answer here, but there's a framing problem. We need to move away from capital attraction and move toward value creation. And with that, Lisa, I am going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Janice Beecher is up next. Janice?
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I want to thank DOE and LBL for supporting this work, Lisa for her tremendous leadership, the reviewers that we had for this project who I think really were tremendous in giving us their insights, and then of course working with Steve and Ron is always great. When we drew straws, the straw I drew was to sort of defend the institutional model of regulation with which we're familiar, and I was happy to do that because of course it's something I'm really passionate about. And what I'm going to present is largely consistent with Steve's presentation, but without math. So you can thank me later for that. In any case, this was a great opportunity to think through these really important issues. So one thing that I've noticed, of course, like others, is that in this context of grid modernization, there is this impulse to provide positive incentives, which Steve laid out from the financial perspective. But more broadly, people are sometimes calling for this new paradigm that the regulatory model just doesn't fit with the goals of modernization. So related to that, you hear the idea that we need incentive regulation. And there's this, to me, sort of a false dichotomy between the traditional model and incentive regulation, because from my perspective, it's always been about incentives. So it's really more a matter of fine-tuning, being more aware of how they work, and maybe paying more attention to the details these days. So the traditional framework, in my view, can actually accommodate both new business models for utilities as well as new pricing models that are enabled in many cases by new technologies. The use of incentives, I think economists will generally raise these these issues, when you do use incentives, you raise these issues of wealth transfer, the possibility of transferring wealth between ratepayers and shareholders, or transferring wealth among ratepayers. And this is a long-standing issue in regulation. A second issue that I raise in the paper is the issue of regulatory activism. And this is a sensitive topic, but in many cases the interest in using incentives has to do with addressing broader social goals that may go beyond the remit of traditional economic regulation. And I think I try to raise sort of a cautionary note about that. So my punchline for the paper is that what may be needed today is not a new paradigm, but a new prudence. When you think about the prudence standard that's traditionally used in regulation, that's what might need updating, because we know today there are opportunities that weren't present even 10 years ago. The other corollary to that is that prudence earns a fair return, but not necessarily an extraordinary return. In other words, prudence should be expected. I want to emphasize, though, that this is not a defense of the status quo for either infrastructure or for regulation. I think modernization offers tremendous opportunities for society, for ratepayers, and so I think we need to be open-minded and embrace those opportunities while being cognizant about the need, to be protective of ratepayer interests. One of the things that I like to remember as we talk about these things is that regulation is not the only set of factors affecting utility performance. Steve just laid out a number of those. They're sort of endogenous and exogenous factors. But when I talk about regulation, I tend to focus on this combination of standards, incentives, and accountability. I think that's a good heuristic for understanding what regulation has been about, both traditionally and moving forward. Some of my work, I think as some of you might know, has been around the idea of the regulatory compact and how that plays out. The compact, and different people have different perspectives on the compact. You may or may not like it depending on which perspective you think is emphasized. I look at the compact from the perspective of the state. And so I'm looking at it in terms of what the state is asking utilities to do. So this sort of provides our guiding paradigm. I don't think the compact is set in stone. I think it's a living and evolving charter. And so I think there's ways to condition it to meet contemporary goals. As you probably know, the compact, under the compact, economic regulation is meant to provide a proxy for competition. And again, I would call that a conditional proxy. The state is offering a monopoly franchise, and they can condition that franchise with various terms. And that may include goals and conditions related to grid modernization. So regulation imposes discipline. At the center of the paradigm is economic efficiency, but regulators have an added responsibility to ensure equity. And I sort of distinguish in my work between economic equity, meaning allocation of cost and costs according to causation. But they also have this additional responsibility for legal equity, in other words, the just and reasonable standard, which I think takes them beyond just a narrow economic perspective. Then we have a third kind of equity I call social equity, which includes things like environmental and distributive justice. Those sorts of equity issues tend to go beyond the boundaries of economic regulation and should probably be deliberated by democratic institutions. So in my view of the compact, there is no guarantee there of investment opportunities or returns on that investment. Neither is the utility shielded from all losses. And in the very long run, the compact does not necessarily ensure their survival if if technologies do become so disruptive that the model no longer applies. So under the traditional model, utility regulators have three sets of very powerful tools. Not everybody sees it this way, but regulatory lag itself is actually a motivating factor under the compact between rate cases. Utilities have incentives for both cost control, some would even say for innovation. It's a passive instrument, but it is actually, I think, purposive, more so than maybe we always recognize. Again, these days in the call for new approaches, regulatory lag is often maligned. So a second set of tools has to do with prudence reviews, and those could happen in the course of a traditional rate case, but they could also happen as a separate sort of review or proceeding on a particular project. Again, those should probably be used somewhat selectively. And even more sparingly, I think we should use incentive returns to motivate innovation. And I think Steve's framework actually provides a lot of guidance for that sort of thought. So in the paper, I also tried to break it down into a little more detail in terms of what I see as the different types of tools that regulators, again, have under the traditional model and how they relate to these particular performance incentives. Starting, of course, with return on investment. Under that rate-based rate of return model, I think it's widely accepted that utilities do have incentives to invest in rate base, and again, contingent on the variables that Steve described. And then we also have incentives for cost control, efficiency, and innovation. Again, I already touched on this. Regulatory lag is getting a lot of attention, and a lot of the modifications of regulation that you see today actually deal with trying to reduce or limit regulatory lag. Many of those actually will shift revenue risk from utility shareholders to utility ratepayers, and that can be an issue. And as I have shown in the table, the effect of lag will depend on trends in efficiency as well as trends in both costs and in sales. So it's really important then to not just to consider regulatory lag, but utility lag. So not all lag may be on the side of the regulator. It may be more incumbent these days on utilities to use strategic management in terms of forecasting, accounting, rate case filings to address issues of lag. So, and I think again in these dynamic periods, that's even more important. So in the paper, I explored 6 incentive areas. This is, I'm sure it's not comprehensive, but it was my attempt to at least explore the idea of incentives and in some ways parsing regulatory fact from fiction. So the 6 areas I describe are incentives that, as I just said, that favor capital expenditure or the spending propensity. That's often a big worry that utilities are still motivated toward supply-side spending. Incentives that favor rate-based treatment or the technology neutrality issue. A case study there is the case of cloud computing, for example, and the idea that by putting an item into the rate base, we will motivate more interest in that type of expenditure by the utilities. Incentives that favor selling output or the throughput motive, and that relates to the issues of decoupling. Incentives that favor high fixed charges. We're hearing a lot about that these days, and the rate design dilemma of trying to recover the cost of service over fewer units of sales. And incentives that favor centralized technologies and how to deal with the prosumer who wants to produce some of their own energy, not only for themselves, but also to sell it back to the grid. And so that raises the net metering issue. And then finally, incentives that favor the status quo. And again, this is the innovation challenge, and that's always been even harder to address in some ways than the efficiency challenge. And for each of these, I've got a little more detail both in the paper and in slides as an appendix to this presentation. So on the issues of wealth transfer and activism, I did spend a little time trying to think about those. And on the wealth transfer issue, this is a very important one because, as we know, utility rates tend to be regressive. In other words, they're going to take a larger share of the low-income household's budget than the high-income household. So when we use utility rates to provide incentives, those will often take the form of some kind of subsidy. And that subsidy, again, could have these regressive effects. So we want to be very careful about this. We want to be careful about using subsidies or incentives that may transfer wealth, frankly, in the wrong direction. we want to be really cognizant of that. We want to be protective of customers. And as I say later, then you want to make sure that you've got appropriate mitigation mechanisms in place if you do choose that policy. And then this issue of activism, again, is very complicated these days because, as we know, economic regulation is just one of many policy domains affecting utilities. We have environmental regulation, resource regulation, security, consumer protection, safety, and so on. Utilities are subject to regulation from a variety of directions. And it's very tempting to, because of the power of economic regulation, it's very tempting to ask economic regulators to do it all. And they tend to get a lot of focus in this respect. And there's even some work being done on the potential value of merging economic and environmental regulation, for example. And the interest in that tends to center on worries about externalities as well as the possible lackness of other institutions in addressing those externalities. My take on this, though, is again to urge a little bit of caution that when we're talking about things like externalities, which to me by definition cannot be resolved easily within the pricing system, we should probably look to democratic institutions and tools that involve taxpayer support rather than ratepayer support. So there are lots of examples here. One involves, for example, the electrification of the fleet and vehicle charging. How would, should that be under the umbrella of the utility monopoly and supported by ratepayers, or would tax incentives or some other mechanism be more appropriate? So one of the ways I think about utilities these days as optimizers, and I also think of regulation then as a constrained optimization problem too. And so I like to see some separation, some checks and balances with regard to policy domains, and where the job of the economic regulators to get us there prudently. And it doesn't mean that regulators should be entirely passive or stay only within their domain. They should be interacting, communicating with other domains. But I think there's something to be said for maintaining those boundaries. So let's see. Sorry, here we go. So getting back to my punchline, that we may not need a new paradigm as much as a new prudence. I think again, the rhetoric that we often hear today sort of asserts this idea of a new paradigm. But new business models, new pricing models are not necessarily a new paradigm, and nor do they necessarily require a new paradigm. So I think what we probably need to do is look at how we think about prudence. And generally that can be shaped by enforceable standards and accepted practices that can be strengthened, I think, in light of the technological advances and opportunities we have today, given the dynamic conditions in both supply and demand. I think the legal standard of prudence still holds, what's known and knowable, but a lot of the new tools available today can actually enhance that understanding. Regulatory tools can also be used to enforce prudence within the paradigm. So I think we need to, try to exercise those tools more effectively. Again, it's not just about efficiency, but about optimizing. And so in the course of regulation, I think regulators have to start asking utilities, if you're not making use of some of these tools, some of these new technologies, why not? And the burden of proof still, again, remains on the utility that they must make the case, and not vendors, not other shareholders or stakeholders. I think that utilities have to explore those options and have to put those forward to regulators. So I list out, and again, I've got those got them in the appendix, a set of sort of a new toolbox for utilities, which is ever expanding. And frankly, this is the set of issues that I probably updated more times than anything else in the paper, because it's a moving target. There's so many new tools available. But it's the same on the regulatory side. There's a number of new tools that regulators can take advantage of to fine-tune their regulatory role, particularly in terms of enforcing some of these ideas. I would say that from my perspective, the role of standards really cannot be overstated here. I think that standards will play an incredibly important role. They always have. And when regulators can point to a standard, sort of a generally accepted standard, a proven standard of practice, they can use that in assessing and evaluating utility performance. So finally, in the conclusions, I lay out some incentive design principles that just, again, it's my attempt at this. I think others could probably refine this much more, but the idea that if you use incentives, they should be purposeful, probably limited, almost with sort of a sunsetting effect. I think the use the goal in their use should ultimately be to let market forces and prices work. Incentive mechanisms should be symmetrical, presenting both upside and downside risks. Incentives should be monitored and evaluated carefully. This is all experimental. Whenever you introduce an incentive, you should really watch for empirical evidence about whether it accomplished what you set out to accomplish. And it's very important, of course, to disentangle the effects of the incentive from other forces, other factors affecting utility performance. And finally, of course, the regressive impacts of any rate-supported incentives should be considered, as well as taxpayer subsidies or corrective rate design to make sure that disadvantaged households are protected. And there's sort of my attempt at sort of a general conceptual framework for thinking about incentives, starting really at the beginning by thinking about whether this should really be addressed, whether there's a need for incentive in the first place, and who will benefit, and whether society or ratepayers or taxpayers or ratepayers should really be supporting the cost of that incentive. So to conclude, I think the rush to replace the paradigm is maybe a little bit overdone and may partly be a function of institutional memory loss. I think those of us who have been around this for a while recognize the power of incentives under the existing model. I also think that to some extent regulators have lost some independence and technical capacity, some due to preemption. And so they may have lost some of the tools that they exercised in the past. So the failure of the paradigm may be less a failure of the theory behind it than of implementation, and maybe we can step up our effort there. I would also say that utilities have become somewhat risk averse, and policymakers have become somewhat conflict averse. I don't want to overstate that, but I think that sometimes might play into some of the some of the rhetoric you hear today. And the issue today may be that utilities actually don't face too much risk, but too little. By keeping some risk in the game, you keep return opportunity in the game, and that's what drives both efficiency and innovation. So one of the incentive problems we have today might be that regulation's been so greatly modified. We have so many adjustment mechanisms and other modifications that the original signaling that happened under the rate-based rate of return formula has been a little bit muted. So I would actually say if you were going to take out a blank piece of paper and try to design an incentive system to motivate modernization, it would look a lot like rate-based rate of return regulation and a lot like the financial model that Steve laid out. So grid modernization combined with regulation provides powerful performance incentives, again in the right hands. I do think regulatory processes can always be improved. New capacities may be needed. But in the long run, just like with utilities, if regulation can no longer serve the public interest, its institutional time may be up, and we'll have to then look for alternatives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan. That was great. Please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. Anytime during the webinar, participants are on listen mode, so that's the way to get us your questions and comments. And if you'd like to direct your question to a specific author, just let us know. We'll answer as many questions as we can following our last presentation, which is by Ron Lair. Ron?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thanks to everybody who helped and supported the project. It's been a great opportunity, terrific chance to learn, and great to work with Steve and Janice again. I'm going to take a more of a practical perspective, and I don't work in a university. I'm not a chartered financial analyst, but I have made decisions as a public utilities commissioner and as a utility board member. I served for 6 years on the board of directors of the Denver Water Utility, so I voted on budgets, capital and operating budgets, and I know what the job of a decision maker is because I've done it. So I thought when I took this on to try to contrast with the other views that you've heard, that my view would be more based on practical experience. And I want to share with you some of the lessons I've picked up since I filed my first case as a young lawyer in 1977 in the wake of Amory Lovin's famous article in Foreign Affairs, Energy Strategy, The Road Not Taken, which pointed out that there's a demand side as well as the supply side in these energy equations. Now, let's see. So my thesis, which I'll present to you, you can be my jury, I'll make my closing argument here, is that regulation as typically practiced in most places is unlikely to capture the benefits of grid modernization. The fundamental reason for that is that the technologies have moved ahead rapidly, but regulation is a lagging indicator in all of this, and we really need to pick up the pace and diversify the presentation of regulatory solutions for a lot of the challenges that the industry and the public are facing. I think Janice got a great list of things that can be done, and I see her edging toward this same outcome. But I want to indict existing regulation a little more than I think she would be comfortable with, and point out that the equity incentives that Steve is talking about are mainly aimed at capital projects. It is a capital-intensive industry. Where the capital goes and what happens to it is of critical concern, of course, but we lack corresponding and equivalent sets of incentives for operating changes and customer engagement, things that show up in expense categories rather than in capital categories on the utilities books. And it's particularly annoying that we stand by doing that, we stand in the way of innovation. Innovation is pounding at the door. There's been a huge influx of capital into the clean tech sector over the last 15 or 20 years, but a lot of that research and development dies in a valley of shadow and death before it gets to deployment, demonstration and deployment. And we need to bridge that gap. We need to bridge it with increase the time and attention to planning, as well as some carefully mounted and evaluated pilots and demonstrations, and in the leading jurisdictions around the country, I'm thinking California, New York, Illinois, and elsewhere, that's exactly what's happening. So I think that we ought to move not away from cost of service regulation. That's still, I think, an important base for providing information to investors and to management, but to add to that box of tricks some new ones, and I'll talk about what I think those might be. I'm also going to make the case that reliance on litigated case process is probably not the way to get there. So let me talk a little bit about what's in the paper I wrote and point out that there are both incentives, disincentives, and a series of judgment calls that ought to make us all a little more humble as we approach these tasks. Financial incentives, I think Steve's done a good job. I would point out that the one place where we really have made progress in adding incentives on the OPEX or operating expense side of the utility equation is on efficiency. And efficiency has really made a big difference now. So 25, 30 years ago, we didn't have integrated resource planning. We didn't have utility efficiency programs. We thought these things up and we started to make them work. And as a collective community, we've gotten some incentives in place so that utilities can run and can benefit from running effective energy efficiency programs. And what I'm suggesting is that we could learn from that experience by expanding a lot of those similar tools to the grid modernization exercise that's the topic here. I'll point out, too, that in the paper I wrote, there's certainly some financial disincentives that provide utilities with signals not to move forward on grid modernization, and certainly imprudence and disallowances probably ring the bell there, and that there are regulatory risks that regulators create by being arbitrary and capricious or not having a clue about where to go or not spending the time to figure out where to go, that are disincentives to the kind of investment in grid modernization that the Department of Energy is interested in. I would also point out that the field of regulation has got a 100-year plus history in regulating monopoly incentives, the incentives for a single supplier in the market to beggar their customers by exercising, the monopoly incentives. But there are an equally interesting and I think much less recognized set of monopsony incentives when the utility is the only buyer in the market. And I think these are critical for grid modernization because of all those third parties who want to do something about customer demand and new technology and a bunch of other things in the sector, but they face the utility operating as the only game in town where they can supply what they have to offer for the public interest in the long term. So monopsony incentives are very important. I think they're a little recognized and not too well understood, but they're there, and you got to think about them, and they're important to recognize. I think it's and Janet's done a good job, so I won't dwell on this. That in rate making, the rate case is divided into two parts. The how big the pie is going to get is part one, the revenue requirement, and most of what Steve talked about is found in phase one. Janice opened up the incentives in rate making, which is phase two, which is who gets what piece of the pie. How do you allocate the cost of the system to the various classes of ratepayers or consumers? And there are incentives there as well, and I think she does a good job of laying out what some of those are. I also addressed some of that in my paper, but there's a rich literature there, and I think we both give you some guidance if you're interested in tracking that. I want to point out, too, another lesson that I've learned over long experience, and that's that the accounting system and the cost allocations that lie at the base of cost of service regulation are rife with approximations and judgment calls. Just a couple of quick examples. One is, what's a fixed cost? Well, that's something that isn't consumed within a year. So we fix the cost of almost everything, and that's in the capital cost accounts, and we call those fixed costs. And everything else we treat as variable costs. Well, that's a judgment call. And there are large differences in classes of property that people argue over how to do this. Likewise, in the allocations, there's a joint cost of production problem. The teaching example of that is a sheep. So if Lisa Schwartz grows a sheep at her farm in Oregon, she sells it for mutton hides and wool. And the question is, what is the hide cost, or how do you price the wool? Distribution, generation, and transmission have this same characteristic. You can't get one without the others. They have to be knit together at some level. And so you have costs that are assigned in the allocation process to those various functions. Those are judgment calls. So when you stand back from the Uniform System of Accounts and from the cost allocation manuals that are used to do these two things, you have to be a little bit humble about the precision that's at the base of cost of service regulation. Planning, in my experience, we pretty much cooked up integrated resource planning in the 80s, in NARUC circles and elsewhere, and that was a reaction to the fact that utilities were presenting large capital investments in rate cases and basically daring regulators to disallow them. That's not a very good way forward, and so we've had a couple of rounds of integrated planning rising to the surface, and I think it's coming back again to bring planning at the distribution level more to the front. But that's a way to provide information to decision makers, which is one of the themes of the paper I wrote, and to build consensus so that risks are lower. And in doing those two things, I think that's a way to change regulation more oriented toward providing good information for decision makers and building consensus to manage risk. Those are two things that I think are hallmarks of a new regulatory approach. Janice mentioned performance standards, and here in my state in Colorado, several of us put a renewable energy standard on the ballot. And so we had a vote here. First time in history, the voters of the state said, yes, we should have a minimum renewable energy standard. Well, that moves the issue of how much renewable energy to have in the utility system from advocacy into policy. It's now a statute in law. It's been tripled. The minimum standard has been tripled by the legislature since we were on the ballot, but it's settled law in our state. So the remit of regulators with regard to that standard is to make the standard work. That's what the public wants, that's what the vote said, and that's what they do. I also make a case in the paper that typically what happens in cost of service regulation is you're looking backwards, you're looking in the rearview mirror at what happened in the accounts. So how much cost was incurred to provide the service and who should pay for that? That's kind of a backward-looking exercise. And what I argue for, and we've argued this in some other work that we've done on incentive regulation, the question I think that where relatively more time needs to be spent is, what do we want and how do we pay for that? So it's more of an economic outlook, and it looks forward rather than backwards. I talk in the paper about formal and informal due process, and I just would say that you can't litigate your way through these issues very effectively. So other ways of providing particularly notice, which is the key element in administrative due process, and getting people involved in rulemakings, policy dialogues, information meetings, and driving for consensus, I think that's the way forward. Public and private decision makers actually end up doing about the same thing in my experience. When you're doing public approvals, you're looking across a contested public record of evidence that's been developed in one way or another at hearings and in discovery and briefs and so on. You're looking across that and you're wondering, where do I find the public interest? What's the right balance to strike to maximize the benefits of this great benefit-creating machine called the electric sector? I mean, we really do prosper because we're a first-world country and can do this. But that's very similar to the kind of investment due diligence that investors do, or that boards of utility companies who are deciding on whether to approve investments have to do as well. So the two kinds of decision making end up as the same inquiry, which is, you've got to vote. You've got to exercise that vote, but you want to make it informed. You want to do the best job you can. So you keep asking questions. You keep probing the people who are bringing these proposals before you with questions that start to illuminate whether to vote yes or no on the proposition. So the recommendations, I've in the last 10 years or so, I've stopped writing recommendations in the reports and studies and things that people ask me to do, and I've started to put questions that decision makers can use. Now, somebody could object that these are leading questions, but that's kind of my job, is to lead decision makers through these questions. So I urge you to think about, what are the key questions that decision makers need to ask about grid modernization, and can you help to answer those? So that's my story. I'm sticking with it, and I hope that gives you a little bit of practical advice to go along with the great theoretical stuff that Steve and Janice have given you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ron. We're going to get to your questions right now. There's still time if you want to add a question or a comment to the chat box, and we will try to get to it here in the next 15 minutes or so. So let's start off with a question, and I maybe have each of you quickly respond. Is the regulatory framework potentially an issue, or is it the planning and procurement processes? Ron, I want to start with you because you actually addressed that kind of head-on in your paper.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think there's too much time spent looking backwards, as I said, into issues that are not very important, frankly. If a regulator ends up with a company that makes about the rate of return that's in the middle of the pack someplace and and doesn't increase its prices too much more than the rate of inflation, they're probably doing a good job. But now we have all this opportunity in grid modernization, and I would say that that's both at the distribution level and at the large grid level. We need to modernize the grid quickly. There's great options to do that, but it's a tricky bit of business because we're going to start using more information technology, more software, and everybody knows that specifying a new piece of software and implementing it in an information system is a big challenge. I mean, we've all done it personally, we've all done it in institutions, and it's a challenge. So we need to get together on where we're going so that we have the functions first and then specify the tools that we need to get those functions. And that's a creative exercise in consensus building, in my view. And if you do it effectively, we can get these benefits quicker. I think regulation will bump along and get us there, but boy, it's going to be a long road if we just try to litigate our way there.
This is Steve. So that's a good question. Just to be clear, the framework that I propose is just a piece of the puzzle. About the framework and planning, those activities provide insights as to what R, K, and I might be. So that's what I'm always looking at is what are those. That model actually is not just a rate-based model. That's a model evaluation of a firm. So I'm going to step away from that for a moment just to let you know that it doesn't depend on rate-based treatment. You can use it for other things. But we're in an industry with very long lead times, very long lives, long lead times. It's a history of planning, a regulatory framework. It depends, I think, on, so is the problem, I think was the question, is the problem with this planning or the framework? Well, I think it depends on what the problem is. Is it, if we're not going fast enough? Ron, I think, has set the stage for that. If the old model probably needs some lubrication to get it to move a little faster. But then we jump right into Jan's stuff, which is, well, perhaps we can use some traditional incentives and some new incentives, and let's fine-tune the process. So I think, but the basic idea is, what is the problem? Is it that we're not moving fast enough? Is it that there's not innovation? If those are definitely problems, then we probably need to change things. But I think we need to ask that question. And Ron said we'll get there eventually. I guess the question is, how fast will we get there under traditional models? That I don't know. But as everything here, that's a complicated question.
Jan,
you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I appreciate the point about the traditional model being somewhat backward oriented, but I actually think that's changing, and I think most states have moved to a more forward-looking approach, or they certainly should. But with that, you've got to be careful not to have regulators picking and choosing technologies. And I actually think, going back to my general framework, there are drivers here that are beyond the utilities. And just as in telecom, and even though I'm someone who hesitates about the, overdoing the comparison of telecom to energy, because I think there's very substantial differences. But as in that area where you saw disruption and you saw new technology come in, I don't think it's stoppable. So I think there'll be market forces at work here, and I think utilities will the smart ones will behave strategically in that environment.
Thanks, Jan. So next question, Steve, for you to answer quickly. You mentioned that one of the options regulators have, if a grid modernization investment is in the public interest but is not in the interest it does not create the most value for existing shareholders, that one tool that could be considered is increasing the return on equity for that investment for the utility. But the point this commenter is making is that if you increase the return on equity, that might also threaten the cost effectiveness of the projects that really are in the public interest. So how can you manage that issue, and do you have any examples of how to do that?
Sure. That's actually a really good question, because people often confuse my thrust of, my topic is quite narrow. It is there a value-based incentive? And that does not mean that what I end up with, just as the questioner suggested, that it's the most cost-effective or in the public interest. That my analysis actually feeds into Janice's and Ron's analysis. So I have no cost effectiveness test. I have no rate test. That wasn't the question I'm addressing. I'm saying, do we understand how value is created? So it's one of the modules that goes in. So if you do a value analysis and you find out that a grid modernization activity, like I had the two-way flows example, was not the most cost effective, and if you raise the return on equity and it becomes, well, it is the most cost effective, but it's not the most valuable, and you raise the return on equity to drive up the value, but then you destroy the cost effectiveness, well, you've got a problem on your hands. The goal of regulation is not to optimize stock prices of utilities. That's merely an input. So in that case, the regulator would have to weigh the balances, and in some cases, and this goes to Jan's regulatory prudence, the utility should ultimately be doing the best thing for its customers in all of those objectives. And if it refuses to do some things because there's not a value proposition, that might be a negotiated effort. But in the end, the regulator, we have to remember, is in charge here. The regulator can say, you need to do this. So that's a very good question, because it shows the dynamic tension between cost effectiveness and value creation. And my framework only deals with value creation, so it allows you to come to the table, but it doesn't give you the negotiated result.
Thanks, Steve. Let's move on to a question for Jan. This commenter says, look, the appeal to democratic institutions such as legislatures to address factors outside the, maybe the current regulatory boundary, that's a traditional view, but it seems maybe a bit limited. Legislatures often pull back from addressing these kinds of issues because they say, look, regulators aren't asking for action. Shouldn't regulators be actively asking for additional tools or expanded regulatory scope to address key economic and environmental issues that they deem highly relevant to their work?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it goes right to the heart of this dilemma. I mean, I do think that regulators should be very engaged with their legislatures. And what I'd like to see restored, frankly, is more regulatory discretion. I think what we've actually seen in the last several years, and there's some current things on the agenda right now, that will actually tie the hands of regulators in what some people call legislative rate making. I would prefer that regulators would have a broad, have broad statutory authority and a lot of discretion within that, to exercise. But I am very concerned about conflating regulatory roles, and I think, the problem is you'll tend to compromise one value or another. So when it comes to environmental issues, safety issues, security issues, I would rather see those standards and requirements set either through other expert agencies, and in some cases set legislatively if that's required, which goes to some of the social issues, and then have regulators take that as a constraint and operate within it. I think there's some hidden and maybe not so hidden dangers, again, when you mix the roles, and you can end up with solutions that are very suboptimal from both perspectives.
Great, thanks, Jan. Let's move on to a specific question about different ways that rates can maybe address some of these incentive issues. So maybe we can start with Steve here. Could you opine on, how formula rates and multi-year rate plans might address some of these incentive issues with respect to recovering utility investments in grid modernization?
Yeah, I saw that question coming in from Ross, and it's a good one, so I anticipated that was coming my way. Well, remember what I said, it's the framework of R, K, and I, and Ross is a capable economist. Let's think this through. Like, what would a multi-year rate plan do to the ability of the utility to earn its return on equity? What would it do to its cost of equity, and how would it affect investment? So that could actually vary, again, from utility to utility, from regulatory jurisdiction to regulatory jurisdiction. But the thing that's not in there that is less of an incentive is any tagging of, say, a grid modernization asset. I talked about perhaps providing a higher ROE to a grid modernization. So multi-year rate plans you could work that in there, but in their general abstract setting, they don't necessarily do that. So I'm not sure that is, like, if you told me I'm going to get higher returns on equity on grid modernization assets and my cost of equity stay the same, I could answer that question real easily. That should increase the value proposition, and if it's big enough, it'll be a winner. Multi-year rate plans depend a lot on all the specifics. I think that one could go either way. So I'm sort of neutral on whether that would help or not in terms of creating a value proposition. Remember, I'm not talking about cost effectiveness. I'm not talking about rates. I'm only talking about this value piece. And I would have to see, is one where I would especially need to see the details to see whether it created a value proposition. And then the question of whether it's a good, cost-effective public policy, that gets deferred over to Jan and Ron.
Well, I'd like to move on to, we have so many other questions, but let me move on to a couple others. So there are a lot of collaboratives on advanced grids currently going on at utility commissions. Are there some model efforts that you're aware of that you think are really asking the right questions or framing solutions in the most appropriate ways? And Ron, I'm going to start with you.
Again, Lisa, how regulators are framing the right questions?
The question is, where are they asking the right questions? Where are they framing solutions in the best ways in the collaboratives you're seeing around the country?
Yeah, I think the REV process in New York is a good example. The UK in its RIO regulation, I think, has cut a lot of ground for performance regulation. California is doing some interesting work with Steve's help and Lawrence Berkeley Lab's help to get the incentives right. So those are the places where you can look for some examples, if that's what the question is.
And this is Steve. If I could just quickly jump in, I think also the Minnesota E21 collaborative, where people are trying to work things out around a table before they get in front. Ron, you said doing things by cross-examination is tough. So the E21 process, I think, is an attempt to do that collaboratively, and I think that is a process that's headed in the right direction.
Yeah, good point, Steve.
So there's a question here for Steve that's pretty narrow, see if you can answer it quickly. You talked about your comparison on the return on equity was made to the market as a whole. Many utilities face substantially lower risk than the market average. So how do you adjust for that much lower risk premium on equity, or do you?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that if you look at that slide from Credit Suisse, it says the cost of equity for the S&P 500 is in the low 8s. It's been that way for 15 years. The cost of equity for utilities must be about in the 7s. Morningstar says 7.5. There really isn't that much different in terms of the cost of equity. So that's really not where the risk manifests. We have to keep that clear. The risk actually, most risk, if you look at like McKinsey's valuation book, is in the ability to earn the return on equity, not the authorized return, but the ability to earn that. So like the Southern Company example that I mentioned, they may be in trouble not to being able to earn a return on the capital invested that's in place, but essentially, effectively, the Plant-Vogel problem. So the risk analysis, ironically, comes in mostly into the expectation of the earned return, but the basic systematic risk that investors face is in that K part. And McKinsey does this, the corporate finance books do this. They say people spend too much time on K. It's not that different from utility to utility. It's all in the specific things that lead to R. So that's where the risk manifests, and then you need to know the specific projects. Are the utilities having trouble with a construction program, or is it smooth sailing? So that's where you would make that adjustment in the R portion, not in the K. That's a little bit of a technical answer, but that's a critically important distinction as to where risk manifests. It mostly manifests in R, so that's where you'd have to do your analysis.
All right, here's a question for Jan. So Jan, this commenter says you referenced the adoption of electric vehicles for utility fleets and utility development and ownership of charging stations as examples of areas that may be inappropriate for incentives, special bonus incentives, or even being able to put that kind of stuff in rate base. Can you elaborate on your concern there, and any regulatory remedy that you can see?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that one because I've spent way too much time in airports lately, and it occurred to me that as you know, Lisa, and it occurred to me that a logical extension of the question is, should electric utilities be running all the chargers in airports that I've used lately? So I think the Missouri Commission wrestled with this recently, and of course made a decision within the confines of the law. As they interpreted it, and that's always going to be appropriate. So, I will definitely allow for a range of solutions here, but I think a number of good issues have been raised, and one is whether the service can actually be provided competitively, and I think we should always ask that about all services. When should they be provided under the umbrella of the utility monopoly, and when should we try to instead cultivate markets that will be suitable to the solution, and so in other words, is there a market failure issue or is there not? And also, if it's in society's interest to expand activity in an area like this, should there be tax incentives or something else? And then a very simple, it really illustrates the wealth transfer issue very effectively, because you're going to have, if you put it in rate base and it's supported by all ratepayers, you will have people who don't have electric cars supporting those costs, and you'll have people who don't even have cars at all supporting that cost. And I think those are legitimate equity issues that regulators should give full consideration to. Ron, did Ron have an answer? Ron, this is Jan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it sounds like we're missing Lisa here.
Yeah, I was going to add, but about the electric charging stations?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the first question would be what kind of competitive solution might exist? What are the costs and benefits of that? Can we get it moving maybe in a regulated setting to do the demo, get the pilot going, show the case, and then turn it over? I mean, it's not going to be one answer everywhere. It's a big country with lots of diversity, so I think lots of experimentation here with different strategies is probably what we're going to be looking at. The question that I want to focus is, what is the outcome we're seeking here? I mean, providing charging for electric cars, doesn't seem to me to rise to the level of a public interest outcome. Providing more electric service for developing technology might be one, but then how do we know we're going to get there? What are the measurements and metrics that we're going to focus on if we're going to make that kind of a move either into rate base or into a competitive solution? How will we know and track and report what kind of progress we're making? This is just simply management by objective in the business school curriculum. But we ought to do a better job of setting up expectations at the beginning of this kind of movement, and then tracking and reporting how we're doing, so that everybody doesn't have to make the same mistakes over and over again. We can make new ones and learn and progress more quickly. And then finally, is there a case, if we're going to have the utility take on some of these new tasks, is there a case to be made that their financial incentives ought to be aligned? But certainly, setting up clear expectations about the outcome, how do you measure and get metrics to track, how do you track and report them? There's a lot to be done there to make sure that we are doing this up front and doing it in a way that people can understand it, that it makes a track record, that we make some history that people can follow, and that will, I think, speed up progress as we go forward.
Thanks, Ron.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jen.
Go ahead. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's really consistent with my thinking on this too. And the other thing I didn't mention is that utilities, in many cases, are going to be exploring this through their unregulated affiliates, and that's another potential area to watch.
Great. Thanks all. Steve, Jan, and Ron, thank you so much for your excellent presentations today. I encourage everyone to download the report and webinar slides at the link that's posted here, and we'll look forward to seeing you again probably in August for our next webinar on the next report, which is on utility and third-party provider roles with respect to the new services that grid modernization enables. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lisa.